This bill will establish legislation for a national redress scheme, the scheme for survivors of institutional child sexual abuse. Children placed in the trust of our institutions were some of the most vulnerable members in our community. That any were sexually abused by the very people charged with their care and protection is a disgrace. No child should ever experience what they did. That is why it is time for all institutions and governments to take responsibility for what happened. The establishment of the scheme is an acknowledgement by the Australian government and participating governments that sexual abuse suffered by children in institutional settings was wrong. It was a betrayal of trust. It should never have happened. It recognises the suffering survivors have experienced and accepts that these events occurred and that institutions must take responsibility for this abuse. The government acknowledged the need to provide public recognition of the suffering experienced by survivors and investigate the inadequate responses provided by institutions through the establishment of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. The Royal Commission. The Royal Commission's Redress and Civil Litigation report recommended the establishment of a national redress scheme for survivors of institutional child sexual abuse. All governments and individual institutions were directed to make amends and take responsibility. The Royal Commission estimates that almost 20,000 survivors were sexually abused in state and territory government institutions. The Royal Commission identified more than 4,000 institutions where sexual abuse took place. The Royal Commission has clearly demonstrated that thousands of vulnerable children were subject to horrendous sexual abuse in institutions throughout Australia. The psychological, physical and emotional injuries can affect a survivor for the rest of their life. In spite of the severity of these injuries, many survivors have not sought or obtained any kind of acknowledgement or redress for this harm. I've met many in my time as Minister for Social Services. The establishment of a national redress scheme acknowledges the abuse that occurred. It is the most significant step in addressing the wrongs of the past and providing a just response to survivors. It is also an important step towards healing. It ensures governments and institutions take steps to safeguard against these crimes being repeated in the future. This bill responds to the Royal Commission's redress recommendations and the Commonwealth Government's commitment to establish the foundation for a nationally consistent redress scheme.